Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Planetary Pause series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are welcoming a stellar union organizer and strategist, Daisy Pitkin. She is the author of On the Line, a story of class, solidarity, and two women's fight to build a union, which just came out in March of this year. I highly recommend you get a copy of it. It's at our local bookstore in Readers, because I asked them to get it. So we have it here, and I'm sure you can also get it online. One of the things that's interesting about this, because recently we have seen great upheavals in union organizing for the first time in a long time. And there are over 100,000 unionized employees have voted to strike in vastly different areas and industries across the country. Some of those places, as many of us have read and talked about, are Amazon, Starbucks, Frito-Lay, even the New York Times. So Daisy Pitkin's book provides a personal and long overdue reckoning of the modern day labor movement. Today, we're going to talk about the nature of political engagement and social change and how hard it has been for workers to form unions under the current labor laws. So Pitkin has spent 20 years as a union and community organizer, working first in support of garment workers around the world, and then for US labor unions organizing industrial laundry workers, primarily in Arizona. Her essays have been awarded literary prizes and include the New Millennium Award. She received an MFA from the University of Arizona, where she was also organizing laundry workers. So welcome, Daisy. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here this evening.
Well, your book was so inspiring to me, and I think it will be, there are a few organizers on this call, so they're going to be interested in hearing the answers to some of these questions and having a chance to ask their own questions. But before we get into looking at some of the horrifying working conditions that you wrote about, I'd like you to maybe tell us something about your background. How did you get interested in union organizing? It wasn't where you started. So what inspired you and what motivated you to do this work?
I grew up in a working class community in rural Ohio. Can everyone hear me? I just want to make sure that my microphone is working. Okay, great. I grew up in rural Ohio in a working class community. Neither of my parents were involved in unions, but unions were kind of around in Ohio. There was a tomato cannery that was unionized and went on strike a couple of times that I was aware of as a young person. And I grew up not too far from a Ford stamping plant in Maumee, Ohio, which was also union and struck from time to time. In fact, my first job was take-home work from the Ford plant, where I would take car parts home with my brothers and sand them for 1/8 of a cent a piece. Return them to the factory, and that's a job that we had when we were young. But I did my undergraduate.
I got you another one.
I did my undergraduate degree in the Twin Cities, and I got really involved in anti-sweatshop work as a student there. It was, the late 90s. And that was a time when there was a big uprising of students about the conditions under which college apparel was manufactured. And students really realizing that we had some power in the situation. We were the ones who were going to buy college apparel or not. And so that was a source of power, and we could use that power to leverage better conditions for workers who were fighting for them in factories all around the world that were producing apparel. And I thought that I was going to really focus on doing that kind of international solidarity work for the rest of my life. I got really involved in it. I was very passionate about it. And then when I was a senior in college, a hotel in Minneapolis, the Holiday Inn Express, won a union contract. The workers there had organized and won. They won a union election, excuse me. And soon after, their employer called the INS and had 7 of the housekeepers arrested pending deportation. And the response from the community and the other workers who belonged to that union astonished me. They rose up almost spontaneously, it seemed to me, and took over the streets. There were candlelight vigils and marches and rallies. And the power of that changed me. And I knew from that moment on that I really wanted to be involved in labor fights and labor organizing here in this country, to be more directly connected to a fight. And so that's what I did soon after I started working for Unite and organizing with industrial laundry workers in Phoenix.
Right. Well, I was interested to know that. And I also was stunned to learn, in your book about the working conditions among the laundry workers. And since I didn't know anything about the kind of jobs that they did, and I'm sure nobody on this call really knows anything about that kind of work, I'd like you to tell us the process and steps in a typical laundry worker's day. What would that look like? What does it look like?
Well, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. Most people don't know that industrial laundries exist. It's a kind of invisible service work that happens. There are lots of jobs like this, the jobs that most people sort of don't want to know about, or it's better if we don't know about them. The jobs that are maybe morally complicated. In the case of laundry workers, the conditions in the factories are so poor that I think it's better for the companies that people don't know about them generally. But they exist in the outskirts of every city and large community all across the country. And they are big industrial spaces where hundreds of workers work. And they wash linens that come from restaurants and hotels or from hospitals. And sometimes, in the case of some laundries, both. But my book really focuses in on the story of one factory in Phoenix that was a hospital laundry. And it's a big factory, 220 workers worked there. The 7-day-a-week operation, 24 hours a day. So it's always pumping out production. And there are a bunch of different departments inside the laundry, beginning with the soil sort department, where rolling bins come off the backs of trucks full of dirty linens, hundreds of pounds heavy, and they get dumped onto a conveyor belt and sent down this conveyor belt, and workers stand alongside the conveyor belt and sort the dirty linen. They put hospital sheets in one bin, and they put gowns in another, and pillowcases in another, and they have to sort very quickly because the linen is coming down this conveyor belt and it doesn't stop. And it's coming pretty quickly, much more quickly than I had imagined when I was a young organizer. And in this department, you can imagine the sort of dangers that workers face. The hospital linen comes full of biohazardous waste. Workers were exposed routinely to fluids bags, to surgical tools that were left wrapped in the linens, sometimes body parts. I mean, the soiled linen comes full of feces and urine and puke, and they are coming into contact with that all day long, constantly. And in non-union laundries, often the personal protective equipment that workers are given is not enough. In the laundry that I write about, before it became union, workers had to wash and reuse the gloves that they were given because the company didn't want to give them new gloves every day. So you can imagine taking these gloves off the end of a shift and washing them and then putting them back on the next day, right? The linen from there goes on another kind of overhead railing system where 300 pounds at a time, bags of linen get shipped along this overhead railing into the wash department. And it's dumped into an industrial lawn washer that is about the size of a school bus. And it's the shape of a tunnel that runs along the length of the factory. And the linen gets put into the kind of mouth of the washer and goes through this very long tunnel all the way to the end. Sometimes linen gets jammed in the tunnel and workers have to climb inside to pull the linen out of the jam. Following proper OSHA procedure is very costly for the company. They have to shut down the machine, allow it to cool, drain it, unjam the machine, and then wait for it to heat up again before they can start production. So workers are under a lot of pressure to not follow those procedures, and sometimes they don't. The linen, after the wash department, water is extracted through this kind of cake machine that pounds the linen down to squeeze water out of it, and then gets put into industrial dryers that dry the linen to a certain extent. And then the linen goes through these irons that are not like anything I'd ever seen before I'd been into a laundry, but these machines that span maybe 50 feet, and you feed linen into one end and it kind of goes through these rollers all the way down the length of the factory to iron them. And then someone catches it on the other side and folds it, right? So these big hot machines that get full of lint, sometimes catch fire. Workers in that department are often burned by the machines, where safety guards are removed to move production faster. And then the linen is folded and counted and packed and put back on the backs of trucks and shipped off to customers where it gets used, and then it cycles back through the laundry again.
It's kind of a horrifying picture. It's not like Willy Wonka.
It is not like Willy Wonka, although, the machines themselves tend to be sort of fascinating, that we've managed to find ways to do a lot of this work industrially. And it's mesmerizing to walk into a factory that's loud and full of these massive machines, and to watch workers work in assembly lines alongside these machines. But if the machines are not properly maintained, properly cleaned, if the safety guards are not in place, if procedures are not followed, it quickly becomes a very dangerous place to work.
Sounds that way. One of the persons that you highlighted in the book, and I was fascinated by, hadn't heard of her, and I should have, is Clara Lemlich, who was a Ukrainian-born American labor activist in the early part of the 20th century. And what a fascinating life this woman had. I mean, starting very young, she was up against so much and didn't really have the support one would have today even. Can you tell us a little about Clara and what she did that was so remarkable?
So Clara, emigrated to the United States with her family in the late part of the 1800s and got a job, as many young women did, in garment factories around New York City. And she started in sort of a tenement sweatshop, making garments at home. And then her mother had managed to lug a sewing machine all the way from Ukraine through London onto a ship through Ellis Island and keep track of it the whole way, which was, sort of a minor miracle. And by the time they landed in New York, the fact that they had the sewing machine allowed Clara Lemlich, after working in a sort of sweatshop for a little while, to get a job at an actual garment factory, of which there were maybe 500 at the time in New York City, right? It was work where workers had to bring their own sewing machines, their own thread, their own needles, every day to, on their backs, and they would carry them into these factories and put them down. You had to rent the chair that you sat in. You sat very crammed into these spaces, shoulder to shoulder with other girls. They were mostly teenage girls who worked in these factories, many of them as young as 11, 12 years old. And some kids who worked in areas of these factories called kindergartens, where they would finish garments by cutting extra threads off. But Clara started working there at a very young age. And she is a really remarkable person because she decided that she was going to learn how to read English after working for 12, 14, 16 hours sometimes in this factory. She would go to the New York Public Library and she taught herself how to read. And then she started a reading group, and they started reading political literature, and she became very radical. And she wanted to organize her sweatshop, her factory. And she did, except that most unions at the time did not really believe that women, and especially not young women, did not believe that they would be good members of unions, didn't believe that they could actually work together and take collective action, didn't believe in their ability to organize and strike. And she finally founded her own union local 25 of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and led a strike of 20,000 garment workers across New York City in 1909, and won one of the first sort of industry-wide union contracts that capped hours, raised pay, cleaned up some health and safety issues inside many, many of the factories in New York City. The story that I was taught as a young organizer to tell about Clara Lemlich, because I worked for a union that was an offshoot of the union that she founded. And so, as unions like to do, we talk a lot about our own history and our sort of mythic lore. And one of the stories that I was taught to tell about the union that I worked for was the story of Clara Lemlich. And the story often went that Clara Lemlich, this teenage girl, was in the middle of a union meeting where workers were trying to decide whether or not they were going to go on strike or not. This anonymous girl just appeared out of the crowd and was hoisted up onto the stage in front of thousands of garment workers at Cooper Union in New York City. And she said, "I think we should go on a general strike." And the next day, 20,000 garment workers followed her into the street. That's the story that I learned to tell about Clara Lemlich. And of course, I told it many, many times through my years as a young organizer. And then I realized that it's sort of a strange story to tell. Like the fact of telling the story in that way of Clara Lemlich, it started to make not a lot of sense to me. Are we telling that story as an inspirational story? When I tell that story to a group of workers, is it meant to inspire them to take similar action? And does it make sense to tell a story like that to inspire people to action? Do any of you here imagine that if someone who you didn't know, a stranger, an anonymous wisp of a girl, as Clara Lemlich was often reported to be, she just arrived on a stage in front of you and said, "We should strike"? Would 20,000 people follow this person into the streets? It's such a story of like remarkable, irreplicable courage that in fact, it's not inspiring. It does almost the opposite. It seems like an impossible, like act of dumb luck almost. It's the narrative of Joan of Arc. It's the narrative often of Rosa Parks. She was just a tired woman who did not want to give up her seat, right? Instead of it being the true story, which is that Clara Lemlich and Rosa Parks were organizers. And they were deeply embedded in the movements in which they were working, right? And they had planned, in fact, the act of not giving up the bus seat as a catalyst to a bus strike that was planned in advance because she was an organizer. And Clara Lemlich had organized over the course of 2 years strike committees in 500 garment factories across New York. And everyone at that union meeting knew who she was, knew what she was going to say, and had planned to follow her into the street, of course, because that's how strikes happen, right? So, I tell the story in the book and kind of untangle the story that I was taught to tell and how complicated it is to tell the narrative in that way, decontextualized from the hard work of organizing that it took to get to a point where 20,000 people are going to follow you into the street, right? And I try to recontextualize Clara Lemlich and her life in a way that made sense to me as an organizer who knows what the grind of organizing work really is, the day in and day out tasks of organizing a union.
I wanted to ask you, what do you consider some of the most effective strategies that you've used in organizing?
Talking to people and listening.
Uh-huh.
Those are the most effective strategies. You sit down with people and you talk with them and you listen to them about the kinds of changes that they would like to see or that they desperately need to see, not even just in their workplaces, but in their communities and their lives. And you can connect those needs with a vision for a different kind of future. And that's what union organizing provides. So I think just talking with people and really actively listening, right? I always say to people who I'm training to be organizers, and there are many of them right now, any conversation you have with someone, with your coworker, or if you are a staff organizer with a worker who's thinking about organizing a union, it should be 80% listening, 20% talking, because that's what organizing is.
Brilliantly said. I wanted to ask you something because another striking thing, I mean, reading your book, striking, I guess that's a good word, is no matter how inhumane and or greedy an employer is of a large factory like that, they are rarely held accountable for the abuses and harm they cause. And this is really astounding on many levels, because often our politicians are talking about human rights abuses in other countries, and yet they totally ignore the human rights abuses in our own country. So do you know of any legislation that is pending that would address the human rights abuses in the labor sector of the US economy?
Yes, there is legislation that's been proposed by unions and progressive groups called the PRO Act. And it would remedy what's broken in labor law right now. You know, it's a human right to be able to work collectively with your coworkers and form a union. And most countries around the world recognize that right. And in this country, we have a branch of the federal government called the National Labor Relations Board that was formed in 1935 when the National Labor Relations Act was passed. And its mission is not just to support the right to organize and protect it, it's actually to encourage union organizing among American workers, to encourage union organizing. There has not been a lot of that happening, I would say, over the last 50 years. It's not been a lot of federal encouragement for union organizing. And part of that is because the National Labor Relations Act is broken, irrevocably broken. And so many loopholes have been built into it. So many pieces of competing legislation have just sort of led to a death by 1,000 cuts of the core protections that it provided for workers. And, you know, we're seeing that now with Amazon, Starbucks, other corporations that are doing anything they really can imagine to try to break the back of unions that are being built in their stores and distribution centers, firing people, threatening people, closing facilities, threatening to close facilities, you know, surveilling workers, everything you can imagine that would be bad or wrong or a violation of these workers' rights to form a union is happening. And the labor board is, you know, the workers filed charges saying, you can't threaten to fire me for organizing a union. That's in fact illegal. So I'm going to file a charge with the National Labor Relations Board. So they filed a charge and the board has to investigate the charge and decide whether or not it's meritorious. And then if they find it meritorious, then they will hold a trial. Months and months and months and months later, perhaps the labor board will sue the company for breaking that worker's right, maybe 6 months before, 8 months before, a year before, right? But already the threat has sent a chill through the workforce and scared people. They don't want to organize a union if they're going to be threatened for 6 months or 8 months. And if an administrative law judge through that hearing finds in favor of the worker that the company did in fact violate their right, I wonder if I did a quiz right now to see, what do you think the penalty would be? What do you think the penalty would be if an employer illegally fired a worker and 8 months later, through this whole long, lengthy process, a judge found that the worker was illegally fired and that it was in fact anti-union harassment and intimidation? What's the penalty? Someone says 15K.
You can write it down and yeah. I would say nothing.
15K. Mike is right. You're giving me a gesture that is a slap on the wrist, right? more often than not, there is no financial penalty. There is no financial penalty. The thing that the company, about 85% of the time, the worst penalty that can be levied against a company is for them to put a letter up in the workplace saying, we violated the law and we'll try not to do it again.
Yeah, really, really difficult.
And then guess what happens the next day if workers start trying to organize a union there again, if they haven't totally just quashed the desire of workers to have a union, chilled it out totally, and workers are still organizing, the next day after they put the letter up, they could fire someone else. And guess what would happen?
Nothing.
The worker files a charge at the labor board.
Right.
The labor board investigates. Months later, there might be a hearing. A judge might find that, and then they put up another letter another year later saying we violated the law. Like that is what labor law is right now. That is the reality.
That's what has become, which is just unbelievable. The employer has all the rights. The worker really doesn't in this situation. I'm not going to go into all these because I want to open it up for questions from people. But the other things that struck me, that one of them you're just hitting on right now, is the worker. It's illegal to fire the worker for organizing a union. And yet what they say now is, well, we can permanently replace them, which is the same thing as firing. I mean, what kind of double talk is that nonsense, So that, and then the right to work states, which seems to be, it should be illegal, and the Taft-Hartley Act, which overturned the New Deal provisions. So those are just things I wanted to throw out there. And if you wanted to say anything about any of that before I open it up to questions, this would be the time to do it.
I think you list a number of the issues that are really at play right now. Workers can get fired. They can be permanently replaced, which if you are a worker who has lost her job, being the difference between legally permanently replaced or fired doesn't matter at the end of the day. You're not going to have a paycheck and you can't pay your bills, right? But there is a way now that employers can permanently replace workers who are engaged in protected concerted activity, which is another loophole that's been written into labor law. And you're right about Taft-Hartley. The core of the National Labor Relations Act, which was a good law, and if it were still in effect in its full force, would still be a pretty good law today. It would do a lot. But 12 years after it was passed, so in 1947, the law was gutted by the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act. And about half of the provisions that were upheld under the National Labor Relations Act, these kind of core rights that workers have, about half of them were just stripped away 12 years after the law went into effect, right?
It's kind of appalling.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I want to open it up for questions from people, because I know I could go on and on, and I don't want to go on and hog it all. So it usually takes a minute or two before people raise their hands while they're thinking. It looks like Ben. Ben is an organizer. So Ben, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, I think more I've been an adjunct to organizers. I've been someone that has been organized by organizers and then have learned how to do that. Like, it's a replicable skill. So the more people that know how to organize, the more people you can organize. I'm following with a lot of interest all of the national media around these labor union successes, like at Amazon and half a dozen Starbucks. But I really feel like there's kind of an optical illusion going on here. The union movement has been going on a steady downward trend since the end of the Second World War. The Taft-Hartley Act that you mentioned, Georgia, was basically the firing shot from the capital class that we're not going to let this Rooseveltian social democracy business with these high tax rates continue. So they have been winding down labor unions. And now it's been mostly through just legal mechanisms of disabling the NLRB. The only reason we're seeing some slight green shoots is that Biden has appointed a better NLRB. Prior to this, NLRB was where labor drives went to die. And I think the thing that I would encourage people to do is keep tracking these stories, because the other part of the story is you can win a union. You can have everybody vote for it. It's a big emotional event. And then the lawyers get to work. 2 years later, everybody is exhausted. You still don't have a contract. I predict that's where particularly Amazon is going to go, unless they get a much larger percentage. So I don't think we should fool ourselves that this is some big revival of movement. It's simply life in the labor movement at this point. And finally, I really appreciate your dispelling the myth of the kind of Rosa Parks organizers, like I've had enough, I'm fed up with these conditions, and we spontaneously walk out. And so people don't work that way. People have to have confidence that you have some resources, some backup, some professionalism, so that they don't take what is a very powerful risk in working class jobs. It's not an easy thing to ask people to go on unions, to try to form a union, let alone go on strike. It takes personal courage, which most people weren't brought up to, cultivate as a virtue. So I think we should keep it in perspective, the magnitude of the labor revival.
You have a comment on that, Daisy?
Yeah, I have to say I've been an organizer for 20 years, and I did not imagine that in my life I would see what's happening now. And I feel really inspired by it. And I appreciate what Ben is saying about, keeping our expectations kind of right sized. It's not as if we've had a strike of, 500,000 workers nationally, like was pretty typical in the years before the NLRA was passed, right? The NLRA, in fact, was passed because employers got very interested in finding a way to legislate labor peace, because the only way to a union before the NLRA was to strike, and workers were striking like crazy all across the country. There was a lot of labor strife that brought employers to the place where they would agree to legislate kind of labor peace. And now that legislated labor peace has come apart. It's completely come undone. And the only way to pass a new law, hopefully a stronger law, is to get to a place again of such great labor strife that the people in power decide that labor peace ought to be legislated. That's what I think about sort of legislation. But I will say, the very beginning of your remarks, Ben, you said, it is, I forget the way you put it, but it was so beautiful that organizing, you teach someone how to organize and they teach someone else how to organize. And it's sort of this ever expanding capacity that we grow in ourselves and in each other. One of the things that I'm really inspired by right now, I'm an organizer on the Starbucks campaign. And I'm really encouraged because what I see happening there is that we are training a very young cohort of workers how to organize, right? So these skills that are being built in 22-year-olds, 23-year-olds about how to organize their own stores and other stores in their city, that's going to stay with them for their entire lives. We're training a whole generation of people how to resist capitalism. And I think, to me, that's one of the most encouraging things. I don't think that any one organizing campaign right now is really going to tip us back into a place where the labor movement is revitalized and has grown back to full capacity, right? It's going to take a long time until we get there. But these green shoots, as you say, are encouraging to me for that reason, because we're building capacity for the future of the labor fight.
Very good. Helen wants to ask something. You want to unmute, Helen?
Yes, I would like to address kind of a local issue with the law enforcement unions locally in Sonoma County and SEIU. And they do not, and the local North Bay Labor Council. There's a real rift there. And I'm assuming that this is a national phenomenon where law enforcement unions are not coordinating or collaborating with other public service workers. And there's a real discrepancy in perks and paid benefits and pay, et cetera. What is your take on all that?
I think there's not nearly as much of a rift as there ought to be. I think unions ought to be taking a close look at the kind of alliances and solidarity that truly exists between law enforcement unions and the rest of the labor movement. Every time I've been on strike, the company calls the cops and the cops show up and try to bust the strike. That's not a kind of working class solidarity that should exist in the labor movement. And I think it should be called into question all the time.
Great. I wanted to
I
ask
don't
something that,
think there specifically, I'm sorry, Helen, but so I can't speak to the specificity of what's happening there, but that's my kind of bird's eye view on the situation as a whole. Sorry to interrupt you, Georgia.
oh, no, no problem. I think, in some of the cases, we see the police unions are quite bellicose, very pugnacious, and they're not people that work cooperatively. I can't generalize about all people in a police union, but I've seen how police unions operate, where they really band together to protect their own no matter what they've done. And I don't think that kind of thinking is in line with SEIU members or other unions where people are more really caring about the majority of people. So I think there might be a different value system there. I know somebody had mentioned to me, in fact, Lori did the other day, and she's not asking it, so I'm going to ask her for her. She's on the call. She said, what is the difference between when you're organizing for, let's say, Starbucks? Are you organizing for all of Starbucks or a particular franchise? How does that work?
Starbucks is an interesting corporation because they have about 8,900 corporate-owned stores. So workers who work in those stores get their paychecks from Starbucks. They're Starbucks employees. And then there are thousands of stores that are not Starbucks corporate stores, they're franchised. And they're workers who work for Aramark or Compass on college and university campuses. Or if you see one that's like in the supermarket or in Target, they work for a company that Target or the supermarket subcontracts with, and they just wear the apron and they have certain drinks, but it's not really a corporate store. And those workers work for companies like Tops or Yum or some other subcontracting corporations, right? The Starbucks organizing campaign that's happening right now, that you see all the headlines about, is happening among corporate owned stores. So it is a direct worker action against the Starbucks corporation, right? And the organizing is happening store by store right now. And we have filed for union elections in 265 stores as of today, and won union elections at 63 of those stores so far. Many, many more vote counts are happening over the next month and a half, right? So that number will continue to grow.
So is there any kind of pressure we can levy as customers, or maybe not being customers for a period of time?
I think that their workers on the ground are really leading this campaign and the strategy, which is one of the things I find also most encouraging about this campaign. It is a true groundswell of worker energy, and workers themselves are organizing their stores and each other. And there are a handful of organizers like me lucky enough to get to support them in this effort. That's really how I feel about it every day, that I'm just sort of lucky to get to be there and see it happen. It's so incredible.
I hope they give you a cappuccino.
I try not to drink too much coffee, but don't tell them. So the workers themselves have asked for a couple of things. One, there is discussion about a boycott at some point in the future, though they have not called for a boycott at this point. Okay. They really want you to go into stores that have gone public with their campaigns and talk about your support with the workers there, whoever happens to be behind the bar. You can order your coffee in the name Union Strong or Union Yes. And it might seem like kind of a shallow or a silly gesture, but it really helps to keep morale up inside the store, because they are getting pummeled by the anti-union campaign day in, day out. And, the company has hired this infamous anti-union law firm, Littler Mendelson, and they and their attorneys are finding every loophole in labor law to try to drag out the process to increase the window of time in which the company can try to break the union before an election happens. So anytime someone comes in and just orders their coffee in the name Union Strong or Union Yes, people celebrate inside the store. It makes them feel supported.
Great.
The other thing you can do is just support the campaign on social media. If you're on social media, like and retweet the things, amplify the voices of workers who are doing the hard work. You can also write a letter to Howard Schultz, who has been newly reinstalled as the CEO of the company, brought back in to do more intense union busting than the old guy was doing. And you can write to him and tell him that as a customer, as a concerned citizen, you are unhappy with the kind of union busting that's happening. And, post the letter that you write online, ask your friends to write them too.
Great, this sounds good. Katie wants to ask something. Unmute, Katie.
There we go. First of all, am I still muted?
No,
Okay. First of all, I really want to thank you, Daisy. It's really lovely to see a young person actually doing so many profoundly important things. Very honored to meet you. I have one question and one tiny question. I'm gonna sneak it in. On the Rosa Parks story, that really was interesting. I have that kind of turned me around in a circle. So I want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly. Are you suggesting that a lot of these stories we hear about one person making this huge change happen is most often a joining of more than one or two?
I would say that's almost always the case, especially if it's a moment in a movement. We like to tell stories about heroes, right?
Right.
And we like to make the stories that we tell very cinematic.
Right.
But those cinematic movements and gestures only work in the context of movement building, of mass collective action. And there's almost always something behind the scenes that is at play.
Absolutely. So that's very exciting to hear. And the other question is, and I'd love to have put in the chat any books or especially articles you recommend, especially on that Rosa Parks theme, because my work is psychology and I work with families and couples a lot, and I work with joining and trying to build coalitions in the home, let us say. So my other question is, what do you find most helps the groups stay connected and coordinated?
I'll try to make my answer quick, but I've been thinking a lot about this. And so my answer is maybe longer than anyone would anticipate.
Go for it. I'll be happy.
This is really at the core of my book, because I wonder what it is that causes people to fight against anything.
Mm-hmm.
And when I learned as a young organizer, what I was trained to know is that anger is one of the most powerful emotions that we have.
Mm-hmm.
And that anger might be the only emotion that is powerful enough to get people through their fear of organizing, right? And it's a scary thing for working people to stand up to their boss, especially when they're working jobs that they need in order to survive. So I was taught that anger was like the driving force of a union fight, and that stoking anger at various points along the way on a campaign kept people in the fight together. And I think after 20 years of doing this work, that's not actually true. I think that anger might be a first step, people being pissed off about whether they're getting paid or that they're in danger at work every day. Anger is helpful to get people into the room, right? But what really gets built over the course of a fight is a community of people who care about each other.
Mm-hmm.
It's a form of mutual aid and love, right? And that is what keeps people in the fight. That's what makes the fight sustainable over the long term. Like if I have an organizing committee meeting for the first time with a group of laundry workers and they come together for the first time, I expect for the conversation that they have to be about the things that make them mad at work. Like we've got to fight for better health insurance. We've got to fight for better personal protective equipment. We need to fight for lower production pressure. We need to fight for better wages, right? But if by the fourth or fifth organizing committee meeting, we're not bringing in food and the kids are in the corner, like making art together because their parents are in the meeting, and somebody's cousins, like mariachi band, is there playing and people are laughing while they're eating before the start of the meeting. If it doesn't look like that, I get worried that we're not going to win. But if it looks like that by the third or fourth committee meeting, I think now we have something. We've built something that no matter what the boss does at this point, it cannot be broken.
It's the
Right.
solidarity you're talking about.
It's solidarity, that's community, it's care, it's mutual aid, it's radical love for each other. And it changes people,
Mhm.
right?
Very
And
well.
that's what keeps people in the fight.
Yeah, and you mentioned in your book, and I'm going to go to Kathy next. You mentioned in your book about the, I guess it's the reconceptualization of how unions are formed and bringing more of a feminine perspective to it, not a top down, but a working together. And when you talked earlier about listening, that's one of the key components of that kind of organizing. So I just want to commend that and bring it forward, because I think that's a very important point, that unions are often organized just on the anger and on the reaction and not on this that you're talking about. Cesar Chavez was an exception. That was really building that kind of community.
It's a reconceptualization of power.
Mhm.
That, you know, we're not fighting out of anger, and we're not fighting to wrest control of the power that the boss has so that the workers have more power, right? The power that the boss has is not a kind of power that workers are ever going to have. And in fact, we don't want that power. We want to build another kind of power and another source of power that makes the boss's power unimportant, that decenters it and makes it not matter anymore, right? It's thinking about the kind of power that gets built through unions and the kind of community that it can forge.
Great. I'm going to go to Kathy next because Ben's already had a chance to ask a question. So Kathy?
Yes, Daisy, thank you so much for writing your book. I downloaded it. I've started it. It's very exciting. I have a question about the NLRA. My grandfather was a member of the IWW, and I kind of grew up hearing that the NLRA was anti-worker, and he hated it because it took power away from the working people. So can you give me your perspective on why the NLRA was a good thing when it started? I'm kind of, this is the first time I've heard it was a good thing. Can you tell me why you think it was good?
But I will say that I largely agree with your grandfather, though the NLRA was a tool that created a core of workers' rights and legislated how they could form unions. And in the 15 years and 20 years even after the NLRA, the labor movement grew exponentially, right? You can look at the chart of labor density, union density, and it looks like a bell curve. And starting about down here is where the NLRA passed, and then there was a ballooning of labor density, and then rights started getting stripped away, and then Reagan busted Patco, and then it kind of collapsed down, right? So it's shaped like that. So it's good in that it allowed workers to form unions without having to strike, and strikes were really brutal. People were injured, killed, you know, and it made a conduit through which workers could pass to form a union without having to undergo action that was often violently repressed, right? So in that sense, one might say that it was a good thing. But as I said before, look, the NLRA was better for companies than it was for workers, right? Companies are actually corporate owners agreed and actually pushed for labor legislation so that workers would stop striking. And then there becomes a real question of what kind of union gets built? What is the strength of a union? You can imagine a bunch of workers decide we want to form a union. The only way to do it is to strike. So together, all together, we have to take this collective action in order to get our boss to recognize our union. The union that you're going to have at the end of that process is it's like forged in fire. That is a strong union. Workers have had to work together through a very difficult time. The kind of solidarity they have is probably, you know, unbendable. It's a strong union that they've built. Now with a new process that says, if you sign union cards, you can have a union. Or later, if you sign union cards, and then the company can say, well, now you have to have a union election on top of it, and then you win your union election, then, you know, there's a lot of people were dismayed by the NLRA because it took the fire out of the labor movement, because it became easier to form unions. And then there was a question about how strong those unions were at the end of it. How strong was the solidarity? How devoted were union members? How active were they in their unions? If all you had to do was sign a card to join. There's a lot of really good research and writing about this very topic. I can pull together some titles, probably not on the spot, but email them later if you're interested in kind of reading more about the thinking behind the NLRA and why it was not an uncomplicated piece of legislation.
I'd like that. That'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you for
Yeah.
that. I'm going to actually go to Mike, and then we'll end with Ben. He'll be the last question. So Mike, you want to go next?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, just real quick, actually. Well, this was great, really, and so informative because, wow, it just obviously dedicated yourself to this. But I was curious if I missed it about the Starbucks. I mean, there's so many, what is it, like, I don't know, 50,000 of them around the world. How many, I mean, this strike that you're talking about now, is it California? I didn't get a sense of how many are involved and how many, maybe you said it, but I missed it. Like if I go here and where I live in Mill Valley, or are they all part of it, or who's actually part of this whole thing?
There's a map. There's a map on a website called More Perfect Union. And they've been doing a good job of kind of publicly tracking the campaign. So there's a map of where is Starbucks organizing. And you can very likely find a store that's not too far away from you to kind of adopt and support.
I see. So I mean, we're talking many thousands or hundreds or
right
stores?
now so there are about 9,000 stores, corporate stores in the US. Okay. Hundreds of them are organizing and in the process of organizing, and the number grows every day. We are at the tip of the iceberg at this campaign. The first store organized in Buffalo 6 months ago, and now we're at nearly 300 stores. So it's growing very quickly, which is I think part of why it's such an interesting campaign to watch. Certainly from the inside, it's interesting to watch, and I think that's why there are more headlines about this campaign than, well, any industrial laundry campaign that I've worked on, that's for sure.
Because we all go
presentation.
get coffees or something.
Yeah.
I'm going to end with Ben, and Ben, I'm going to ask you to not make it long, if you can.
Okay. Well, I wanted to return briefly to Katie's question about the Rosa Parks narrative, because I think if we're looking at the phenomenon of unionization as a social and interpersonal phenomenon as well as a legal issue, there's the defect with the Rosa Parks narrative is it feeds into this hyper-individualistic culture, which is that is the essence of the American culture, is this atomized hyper-individualism. I would like to see people in the labor movement start to valorize the collective action. Because I always remember it chaps me hard when I hear the Rosa Parks thing, because it's so absolute. When you know the real story, you think these people are lying to some effect. They want to make sure you don't understand that an entire community, a whole cadre of activists. She was picked because she was the boldest one, the smartest one to carry out the action. They said, okay, you're going to do this, and that'll set off the fire. It wasn't just because her feet were hurt her and she was tired. So I hope that if we can kill that narrative, we're doing everybody a favor. And then finally, I do want to address the issue, because I'm very conversant about the issue of the police associations and the labor councils. This is a source of real confusion to people. And there is lots of talk inside the labor movement itself, inside of central labor councils, the more radical ones, that we need to kick out the police associations. They are not the same kind of union as the main constituents of the rest of the labor council. Most labor unions now, it's been reduced to public sector unions and teachers. Those are the big, powerful unions. But because the police unions are in the labor council as a whole, it really pollutes the politics of the labor council, frankly. And if you're going to build a working class movement, you can't have the people who are going to crack their heads if they do an action in your union. I'm in favor, and I've on record at the labor council as we should kick the cops out, let them do their own thing, because they're not even unions. It's an association. For them, it's like their own little HR department that basically keep them from being fired, no matter how outrageous their behavior is. So yeah, I think they got to go, from my point of view. So
Your comments?
that's my take on it.
What do you think, Daisy?
I agree. And also I will say on the Rosa Parks story, I would like to disabuse people of the notion that Rosa Parks was an atomistic actor who was very tired, because that's not the true story, right? And at the heart of my book is repositioning the collective and collective power, and thinking about what it means to build a union through communities of care, thinking about solidarities that way, thinking about solidarity in that way, and thinking about unions in that way as a source of that kind of collective community, right? And I write very much about Clara Lemlich and question the story that was told about her in that same way, in order to disabuse this notion that that really treads very much on the national narrative of individualism and undercuts the whole purpose of unions and the source of their power.
Well put. This has been a really exciting program today. I really appreciate your willingness to answer all our questions and be so articulate and clear with our group. It's been very exciting. I feel like I've learned a lot through your book, which is on the line, and I want to highly recommend to people who haven't read it yet. You will get a lot from it, and it's in a way, it's an easy read because you keep wanting to go on with it. You don't stop. The stories are really good and well put together. So I want to thank you, Daisy, for being with us today. I'm going to send you the link for this recording, and I'm going to stop the recording now. Thanking you.
Thank you so much.
You're certainly welcome.